welcome to our review of Group 4, which covers the aggregate model, fiscal policy, and investment demand. This is by Felicia J. Seelan and Jiwon Lee. Before we get to that, we'll first talk about GDP, which is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country over a period of time. GDP is the sum total of a nation's consumer spending, government spending, gross private investment, and net exports. GDP can be measured as nominal or real, though we'll mainly be talking about real GDP in this video, which is GDP adjusted for inflation. The first concept we'll cover is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the value of total demand for all final goods and services in the economy. It's plotted on a graph with real GDP and price level, which is the average of an economy's prices across all goods and services, as those are the two factors that will affect this value. Aggregate demand is equal to real GDP, so changes to real GDP will directly affect the AD curve and vice versa. It slopes downward because of the wealth effect. When the price level drops, consumers spend less on the same items and are therefore relatively more wealthy than at a higher price level. So they will demand more goods and services, leading to a downward or rightward movement along the AD curve. When the price level increases, consumers will be less wealthy and will thus demand a smaller quantity of goods and services, causing a leftward movement along the AD curve. Movements along the AD curve are only caused by changes in price level. The key determinants of shifts in aggregate demand are the components of GDP. For instance, a decrease in consumer spending due to a change in consumer preferences will result in a leftward shift of the AD curve, as consumers will demand a lesser quantity of goods and services at every price level. When the government increases spending in the economy, the AD curve will be shifted to the right at every price level. Changes in net exports will also affect aggregate demand. If a nation imports more than before, net exports will decrease, as it is the difference between exports and imports, and the AD curve will be shifted to the left. Finally, changes in investment spending will also affect aggregate demand. Increases in investment spending will induce a rightward shift of the AD curve, whereas decreases will shift it leftwards. However, unlike other determinants of aggregate demand, investment spending is influenced by interest rates, and the relationship can be visualized through the investment demand graph. Quantity of investment spending is plotted on the x-axis, whereas interest rate is plotted on the y-axis. Like the demand graph, investment demand slopes downwards. This is because at higher interest rates, the cost of borrowing is relatively higher, so firms must produce a greater return on investment in order to pay back the greater amounts of interest. In contrast, at lower interest rates, money is relatively cheaper to borrow, so firms will take out more loans and will thus increase their quantity of investment. As consumers can't purchase goods that don't exist, opposite to the AD curve exists the aggregate supply curve. Aggregate supply is a measure of the sum total of goods and services supplied in the economy. Unlike aggregate demand, however, there are two types of aggregate supply: short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. SRIS slopes upward due to a variety of factors, including the misperceptions theory, where producers think their prices relative to other producers decline after price level drops, inducing them to supply a lesser quantity of goods and services. This upward slope is also because of the sticky wages and prices theory, where prices and wages can't be changed quickly in the short run, leading producers to supply insufficient or surplus goods. Like aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply can be influenced by a variety of factors. The first is input prices. When input prices are high, such as wages, the cost of capital and raw materials, producers will supply a lesser quantity of goods and services at every price level, and aggregate supply shifts leftward. In contrast, when input prices are low, SRIS shifts rightward. Next is productivity. When productivity increases due to advances in technology or improvements to human capital, such as better education or health, SRIS shifts to the right, and decreases in productivity will shift SRIS to the left. Another factor is the legal institution environment. When the government imposes taxes on producers, they'll supply less at every price level, shifting SRIS to the left. In contrast, when the government offers subsidies, SRIS will shift to the right. Finally, changes in the value of a nation's currency in the foreign exchange market will shift SRIS. When a country's currency has a strong valuation, imports will be relatively cheaper and thus foreign resource prices will be lower, shifting SRIS to the right. The opposite applies when a country's currency has a weak valuation, as foreign resources will be relatively more expensive, causing a leftward shift. Unlike short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply represents an economy's potential output regardless of price level. In the long run, wages and input prices can adjust, and thus LRAS is vertical and does not slope upwards or downwards. Long-run aggregate supply represents a point directly on the nation's PPC, and also represents the full employment level of output, where unemployment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. While LRAS is not influenced by input prices or nominal wages, it can be influenced by the availability of an economy's factors of production. For instance, an increase in investment in the quantity and productivity of capital, or growth in the labor force, will shift LRAS to the right, representing an overall increase in the production capabilities of an economy. The intersection of SRAS, AD, and LRAS denotes long-run equilibrium and can be represented by a point directly on the production possibilities curve. At this point, the rate of unemployment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment, and cyclical unemployment is non-existent. An economy will always seek to be at long-run equilibrium, though in the real world, an economy will constantly be facing recessionary or inflationary pressures. In a recession, short-run equilibrium, or the intersection between SRAS and AD, will be to the left of SRAS, resulting in a negative output gap. This is an indication that the economy is underproducing relative to its true potential, and represents a point inside of a nation's production possibility curve, and the trough of a business cycle. In a recession, unemployment will be higher than its natural rate, though in the long run, a decrease in workers' wages will eventually lead to a rightward shift of the aggregate supply curve, returning the economy to a long-run equilibrium at a lower price level. In the case of inflation, short-run equilibrium will be to the right of LRAS, resulting in a positive output gap. This is an indication that the economy is overproducing at an unsustainable level relative to its true potential, and is represented by a point beyond a nation's PPC and the peak of a business cycle. Amidst inflation, unemployment will be lower than its natural rate, though in the long run, as producers increase workers' wages, aggregate supply will shift to the left, and long-run equilibrium will be re-established at a higher price level. If an economy will eventually return to long-run equilibrium regardless of whether it's facing recessionary or inflationary pressures in the short run, why might the government step in and administer fiscal policy? Well, it isn't solely because the government loves to control people. While natural shifts to SRAS will return an economy to long-run equilibrium, this process can often take an extended period of time, and given that unemployment and inflation take a large toll on a nation's population, it's in the best interest of the government to intervene. The government can use two types of fiscal policy, expansionary and contractionary policy. Expansionary policy is used when the economy faces a recession, while contractionary policy is used when the economy is experiencing inflation. Furthermore, they can utilize discretionary policy or non-discretionary policy. Discretionary policy involves direct intervention of the government, whether that be through changing tax rates or increasing or decreasing government spending and transfer payments. Non-discretionary policies are policies that are already built into the system, such as progressive tax system and unemployment benefits. Progressive tax systems will increase the tax burden as income increases, reducing AD. Unemployment benefits will increase transfer payment and consumer incomes for people who are unemployed, also increasing AD. Non-discretionary policy does not require the direct approval of Congress, and it is meant to stabilize the economy automatically, and are labeled automatic stabilizers. The key to understanding the impact of fiscal policy decisions is the fiscal multiplier, which is the rate of change in aggregate demand from an initial change in government spending. The fiscal multiplier is found by dividing 1 by the difference of 1 in the marginal propensity to consume, or 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save in an economy. The marginal propensities to save or consume are the degree to which consumers will spend or save every extra dollar of disposable income. The sum of MPC and MPS will always be 1, and the greater MPC is relative to MPS, consumers will choose to spend a greater amount of extra dollars of disposable income. As a result, when MPC is very large, the resultant changes in real GDP from changes to government spending will be relatively large as well, as the downstream effects of spending will be relatively large. While the fiscal multiplier is used to calculate the magnitude of changes to real GDP from adjustments to government spending, the tax multiplier can be used to calculate the change in aggregate demand from a change in taxes. The tax multiplier can be found by multiplying the marginal propensity to consume by -1 and dividing that by the marginal propensity to save. The negative multiplier is due to the negative change in aggregate demand that arises from increasing tax collection, as doing so will decrease disposable income. Ultimately, the government must make a trade-off between increasing inflation or unemployment when using fiscal policy to return an economy to a long-run equilibrium. However, these options represent a more favorable option than letting the economy potentially tank or enter a period of stagflation, where negative supply shock results in both high inflation and unemployment. That's the end of our review video. Thank you for watching.